Hello and welcome to The Eternal Quest. I'm Paul Meyer. In today's program, we are honored to have with us as our guest the internationally known seminar leader and consultant on human development, Dr. Jean Houston. In examining Jean Houston's work, it's difficult to ascribe it one of the usual disciplines of psychology, philosophy, or comparative religion. And indeed, she herself has demonstrated a desire to go beyond the conventional ideas about ourself and our place in the world. In this interview with Bill Metzger, she recalls some of the unique experiences which put her on the path, as she puts it, of trying to discover the possible human. Having lived in over 40 countries, Jean Houston sees an emerging global society, one in which the usual rules of living and learning no longer work as well as they once used to. Her task, as she conceives it, is to help us repattern ourselves to meet the challenges of the times. One of the ways she does this is by resurrecting some of the ancient myths from our various cultures. For it is in these stories, she claims, that we can access our vast but as yet untapped potential. By working with myth on physical, psychological, and spiritual levels, she says that we can access this understanding and thus literally reinvent ourselves and our world. She sees a new spiritual technology emerging and claims that we have become, quote, the mythic beings that we dream of. A past president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology, Jean Houston has written and co-authored several books, including God's Seed and The Hero and the Goddess. She and her husband, Dr. Robert Masters, are co-directors of the Institute for Mind Research in Pomona, New York.
Jean, are there any incidents from your early life that you feel have really helped shape what you are today, who you are today?
I think there are many incidents, but I think of two that occurred within 2 weeks of each other in my 8th year. The first one was, my father was a comedy writer. He wrote The Bob Hope Show and Fred Allen and Fibber McGee and Molly and all the great comedy radio programs. But in one year he was writing Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Now you may remember that Charlie McCarthy was a little wooden dummy and Edgar Bergen was the ventriloquist. And my father said to me, "Hey kid, you want to come with me and deliver the script to Edgar Bergen?" I said, "Oh yeah, Daddy, let's go," because I love to talk to Charlie. Bergen would put Charlie on my knee and we'd have these funny, comical, very childlike conversations. So I went along, and there was Bergen sitting with his back to us, talking to Charlie. Not unusual, we thought he was probably rehearsing, but as we listened, we discovered that he was not rehearsing. He was asking Charlie ultimate questions, like, "Charlie, what is the nature of life? Charlie, what does it mean to be truly good? Charlie, what is love?" And this dummy, this little wooden being, was answering like a kind of wooden Socrates. The numinous knowings of millennia was just pouring out of his little wooden mouth. And then Bergen would get so excited at the answers. He said, "Yes, Charlie, but where can we find truth? What is the difference between fact and truth?" And the little dummy would think for a moment, and then this extraordinary barrage of wisdom would pour out. Well, after a while, my father, who was an agnostic Baptist, got obviously very skeptical and very worried, and so he coughed. And Bergen turned around, saw us, turned beet red, and said, "Oh, hello, Jack. Hi, Jean. I see you caught us." And my father said, "Yes, Ed, what in the world are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm talking to Charlie. He's the wisest person I know." And my father said, but Ed, that's you. That's your voice. That's your mind coming out of that dummy." Ed said, "Yes, I suppose ultimately it is. But you know, when I ask him these questions and he answers me, I haven't got the faintest idea what he's going to say. And what he says astounds me with his wisdom. It is so much more than I know." And I could just feel, my future rising. I mean, that in some sense, in my 8-year-old way, I knew that what we are compared to what we think we are is so much vaster that it's as if we as if we are living in the attic of ourselves with the first, second, third, and fourth floor relatively uninhabited and the basement locked except when it explodes from time to time. You know. Well, several weeks later, I was in my school. I went to a wonderful school, one of the 29 that I went to before I was 12, but this one was the one that I went to the most. PS6, it was an experimental school in Manhattan. And we children were taught mathematics through dancing, because in some sense they were continuing the old John Dewey knowing that if you're going to educate a child's conception, conceptualization, you educate their perception. So we learned math through music and dance. And we lived as Iroquois for a week to study anthropology. And they thought that we should be taken to meet the great elders of the time. So we were trotted across the river to meet Albert Einstein, who I remember as being very vague and little else, a great deal of hair, even more than I had. And, but what I remember most was when our teacher, Miss Egeltinger, took us to meet Helen Keller. But first, Miss Egeltinger read to us from that tremendous piece of writing where Helen Keller says that for the first 6 years of my life, I virtually had no concepts whatsoever, having been, by the time she was a year or so, deaf, dumb, and blind. And my teacher, Miss Sullivan, tried in vain to try to help me put concepts to things, but it wouldn't work. She would tap out ideas and names for objects, but I was like I just could not understand anything. And finally, in desperation, she took me to the ivy-covered pump house. And she pumped a cool, clear something into one hand, and the other hand she tapped out W-A-T-E-R, W-A-T-E-R. And Helen writes, I stood still, my whole body wrapped. Suddenly I knew that cold, clear something meant what teacher was tapping into my hand. And that word water dropped into my mind like the sun into a frozen winter world before that supreme event. There was nothing in me but eating and drinking and sleeping. I woke up. And of course, Helen then went on to become the friend, the teacher, the midwife of souls to hundreds of thousands of people. Well, with that introduction, Miss Egeltinger took us to meet Helen Keller. I believe it was at the Cosmopolitan Club in Manhattan. And Miss Keller spoke to us in that awesome voice of someone who has really never heard speech and doesn't really know pitch, but has great emotional power and clarity. And I remember being so deeply moved. Remember, I had just come from my Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy experience, that I knew I had to say something. I didn't know what it is, but I knew I had to say something. So I went up to her, and I presented my lips to be read. And she took my hand, and she did not read my lips with her fingertips. She read my entire face, so that my lips were on the center of her hypersensitive center palm. And then she read my whole face and expression with her hands. And I blurted out, "Why are you so happy?" And she laughed and laughed. And she said, and it sounded something like this. I'm being a little clearer than she actually was. She said, "My child, it is because I live each day as if it were my last. And life in all its moments is so full of glory." And life in all its moments is so full of glory. Was she damaged? Yes. Was she damaged? No. She had rewoven her mind, her body, her sensibility, her heart, and she was the possible human, you see. And I think it was those two incidents together that put me on a path of trying to discover the possible human, realizing that we are much more than we think we are. And so I was very fortunate to have been raised in the time of the golden age of brain and mind and body and cross-cultural research, and be able to spend much of my life discovering these latent potentials that we all have for learning, for being, for breathing, for using our physical and mental and psychological bodies, and also to be in a time when this information is available from many cultures as well as from laboratory research, and to be in a time in which factors absolutely unique in human history are rising, that require that we make use of the whole brain, whole mind, whole bodies in ways that we never had to. I mean, we have become the mythic beings that we dreamed about in previous
From
centuries.
very early, you really were acculturated by all that changing of schools and so forth.
Yes.
To a very wide exposure to possible humans.
Well, it was in America, but America, you know, I was in school in America, meaning...
Still, there was a multicultural dimension.
Yes, it was
to that.
multicultural. I mean, if you went to school in Biloxi, Mississippi one day, and Bemidji, Minnesota the next, you were in radically other realities.
Yes, right.
So I was acculturated to
Right.
a great variety of... And also, I'm half Scotch and half Sicilian, and those two families could not have been more different. One thing I discover in my work around the world is that cultures are becoming more so. They're not becoming less. You know, the Balinese are becoming more Balinese. In some sense, you know, the Vietnamese in Northern California are becoming more Vietnamese. I mean, cultures, it's as if we're all becoming members of several cultures. The culture of our ethnic heritage, the culture of our general country, and then our subcultures, whether we are windsurfers, you know, or paper mache makers or what have you. We're living in the time in which the membranes are broken, you know, not just the ecological membranes, obviously, but the membranes between cultures. This century and the next century are the century of vast, vast migrations. And so I think that, you know, factors unique in human history are happening that we've never known before. We're moving towards globalization, but with high individuation of culture, you see. We're moving to a planetary psyche, again, the old noosphere that Teilhard de Chardin spoke about, the mind sphere. And this is causing us to complexify in our own mind-brain systems. I mean, not only do most of us have anywhere between 10 to 100 times the amount of experience, just sheer experience, that our ancestors of 100 years ago had. But most of us, by virtue of the facts that the old maps of reality have been rolled up or burnt, most of us are far more wounded and are unprepared for the sudden shifts and challenges. So these factors which are pushing, these factors of human expansion that are being required in our time, we can no longer be educated for the year 1895, which is about where a lot of our education is. I'm amused by many of these new books about what the higher cultural education should be, written by men who seem to want, who are longing for an education of pre-World War I Oxford, you know, not for the growing complexity of a world civilization. So these factors of the revolution in the understanding of human capacities, and with it the deepening of spirit, the fact that we are living in a time of the harvesting of the spiritual technology and the spiritual ecology of many, many cultures that was never available before. This is deepening our relationship to the sacred and making daily life a spiritual exercise almost a requirement. And then, of course, the fact that all of this is being sent around the world at practically speeds of light. I mean, we're living in a time of absolute global theater. It's not just the great political ideologies changing and shifting, that tremendous political theater that most of us have been glued to our television sets watching, and the economic theaters. But it is the theater of different styles of being that are coming to us with a tremendous simultaneity and can be repeated by virtue of videotapes, you see. So that all of us are being profoundly stimulated into joining this world mind. And I don't think it's the same brain, as I said, that it was 100 years ago. I mean, it may have the same structures, but the dendritic, meaning the connections between cells, is thickening.
And how do people experience this kind of change, just in terms of their own lives? As you travel around and do workshops with large numbers of people who are exploring these issues of what is the possibility for them, how does it change their lives?
Well, I think they move daily between glasnost and claustrophobia. You know, we still are patterned with ancient shadows. I mean, our very brain was cooked in ancient caves, and so we still have often very archaic responses to things that we should be able to self-orchestrate. And I think people know that. We know that we are profoundly unprepared. And so I find that in my work, people come asking for a new order of preparation, a new order of education. And I find people all over the world, regardless of where they are, deeply responsive to the growing of mind and body and psyche. However, you know, for many, many years I've worked in the area of research into what human beings can do and be. But I find that just presenting this research and a lot of exercises is not sufficient. You cannot do this anymore because the story is too big. We have become citizens in a universe larger than our aspiration and far more complex than all our dreams. And the only way that you can take on this amount of information and this citizenship is to embed it in story. Because a story will carry the thrust, the depth, the complexity, the specifics of a great deal of information that just plain information will not. So that, for example, what I have developed over the past 15 years or so is working with well over 100 different stories. From the Odyssey, which is my personal favorite, to the Quest for the Grail, or if I'm in India, I work with the Ramayana. If I'm in China, I may work with the story of Kuan Yin. If I'm in South America, I will work with some native stories. With the Native Americans, I work with, let's say, the story of White Buffalo Woman. Because I find that the great stories, the stories of the far-flung heroes and heroines of 1,000 faces, are stories that call to the basic parameters and dimensions of where we are trying to go, that we are called in the great stories. We are called. Often we refuse the call. Not now, God, maybe next year when the kids grow up, when I get my doctorate or whatever. Yeah. And then, of course, invariably we blunder into accepting. And then we cross a great threshold of our own being. We cross the threshold of our profound recalcitrance, what we call the homeostasis effect, don't rock the boat, but somehow we get across. And we find ourselves in the belly of the whale, being regestated. That can be a profound depression, the belly of the whale, or it can be a profound ingression, which is perhaps a little more creative.
Well, there's such a difference between the story, which can continue to feed you in new ways, and an idea.
On the story, you get allies, supernatural, or allies of your own inner space. You are guided, you enter into challenges, into honing places, into desert places of the mind where you meet the great shadows of yourself and discover that the shadows are often that which has been left unexpressed. As they say in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, what you express will bring out, will save you. What you don't express is not going to be so good for you. It can kill you. So that beyond the shadow is often that you meet on your road of trials, a road of adventures deep within the soul's journey, are often those very shadows, the depth of which gives you often your greatest promise. Well, anyway, to continue this great story, at a certain point you meet with that which I have called the beloved of the soul. I wrote a book about it called The Search for the Beloved. And this beloved, to me, is the archetypal essence of what we are, writ large. It is the God self within. A story that I like to tell about the meeting with the beloved is I had occasion to work with Mother Teresa of Calcutta once. And I got to know her fairly well, so I could ask this kind of question. I said, Mother, how does it happen that you are able to do so many things that local helping organizations like the Red Cross just don't seem to be able to do as effectively? How can you save every little child who's put in the creche outside the convent and give them a decent education and a good life? A Hindu man who's dying on the streets of Calcutta, to take him in to nurse him back to health, or when he dies, give him a good Hindu funeral. How can you do all these things? And she said to me, my dear, it's because I am so deeply in love. I'm in love with Jesus. I'm married to Jesus. I said, yes, of course, all nuns are. No, she said, you don't understand. I really am. And she said, he is my beloved. And I am so much in a state of loving with my beloved that I see the face of my beloved everywhere. I see my beloved in that day-old child you spoke of, in that man dying on the street, in that leper coming to me. And I cannot do enough for my beloved. And my beloved cannot do enough for me. doing something beautiful for God. And she said, and that's why I'm able to do these things. Now for Sister Teresa, Mother Teresa, the archetype of the beloved is the collective archetype of the culture, with Christ. And I've spoken to Buddhists for whom the beloved is some variety of Buddha, and Hindus, Krishna. But for many people, the beloved has a more particular lensing, and it can come in many ways and in many different forms. It can be radically personal to the person if it's not part of the collective archetype. In my study, which I did some years ago, of 55 of some of the most creative people in the world, of whom Margaret Mead was one, Bucky Fuller was another, but there were others, many whose names you would know, some you wouldn't. I found that in almost every case, these people had some profound relationship to an inner persona, a dimensionality whom they thought of as their great friend, ally, who met them at that point of connection in the heart and then was extended into, shall we say, deep space and deep time.
Now, you've done a lot of work working with groups of people who are exploring the possible human, but you've also been working on a little bit of a larger stage with your work with governments.
Countries,
countries.
bioregions. I've worked in over 40 countries at this point. And what happens is that I'm called in by generally development agencies to come to a country. So I will go and I will live in that country for a period of time. And I will live at all levels. I'll live in huts in southern India. And as they have been living for 5,000 years, I will live in Maharaja palaces. I will live with people who are teachers, who are out there in the work. I'll live with farmers. And after a period of time, and I've also done a lot of research, I will have soaked up a lot of sense of what is trying to happen. And it may not be intellectual knowledge. I mean, I will have stocked myself beforehand, but it will be a kind of hypersensate sense of that culture. And then I will, of course, give a lot of speeches, often to try to, also to find out from people like corporations or educators or insurance agents, to try to find out what is trying to happen in the culture. And then I will gather anywhere between, well, it can be quite a substantial number, anywhere between 80 to 200 of the leaders or the social artists of the culture. And this has been prepared ahead of time so that they know they're going to come. And we'll be together for maybe 10 days. And I will take the core myth of the culture. So, for example, in India, I will work with the Ramayana. Or this year I worked with the life of Gandhi. Last year I worked with the Ramayana. And we will do it as a journey of transformation. We will follow the journey of Rama and Sita's abduction by the devilish Ravana, and the attempt of Rama to come to terms with all his parts and all his nature to be able to find Sita again. And we will play it out physically, mentally, psychologically, spiritually, in all kinds of exercises in which they prime their minds, their bodies, their souls, in which they tell stories of their lives as that life of their personal particular begins to relate to the personal universal of the great juicing, greening story that they've heard all their lives. So they're always going back and forth between the personal particular, between their own psychological, psychophysical, and spiritual growth with the processes that we give them to do, with the great story, and with India herself and India in the world. And before you know it, there is a sense of illumination, and the way the great story of the Ramayana then ties this all together. Because a great myth is something that never was but is always happening. A myth is like the coded latency in the soul, the DNA of the human psyche. But it is more than the human psyche, it is the DNA of the cultural psyche as well. And what I find happening all over is that these ancient myths are rising, not only to be plumbed for their deeper meaning, but also to be rejuiced, as it were, for their extended unfolding. And we find that by working in this manner, as I say, I've been working with well over 100 myths and stories around the world, but always with the deepest cultural story of the time. I work in these different cultures. And we find that this evokes their sense of possibility and their commitment. I then put them into, or arrange for them to have ongoing teaching learning communities where they continue to grow and deepen. I know from my work, I'm absolutely certain, and I say this unequivocally, that all of us contained the capacities to be able to deal beautifully with orchestrating this very complex world. Because let's face it, we have two big choices coming up very soon in our time. Our children's children will have this choice. And that is to help make paradise on earth or to go up into heaven. It's either resurrection of the world, the land of our bodies and minds, and making a viable place to live, or liftoff or resurrection.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill,
for sharing where you're at these days, and look forward to talking again.
Thank you.